Welcome to my channel. Tonight, we journey into a story of silence, sacrifice, and the weight of what it means to be human. It began after the Great War of the 12 Systems, a conflict that had burned through stars and left galaxies trembling. The Galactic Council had finally declared peace, but peace was a word spoken too late. Among the billions of lives lost and the ruins scattered across alien worlds, one figure stood apart, the last Terran commander, a man known only as Elias Ward. The name once carried fear among the enemy and pride among his people. But when the war ended, and the treaties were signed without honor or justice, Elias simply laid down his rifle, turned his back on the stars, and vanished. No one knew where he went or why. To most of the galaxy, humanity had been the fire that lit the war and the shield that ended it. But to Elias, humanity had become tired of being saviors. The Council had betrayed them again. And so, when the Terran fleets withdrew, the galaxy cheered their departure, never realizing what would happen when humanity finally stopped caring. In the years that followed, the stars grew quieter. Without the Terrans, the fragile balance the Council had built began to crack. Pirates returned to trade routes, old enemies resurfaced, and ancient species began testing the boundaries once held firm by human fleets. Yet, the Council remained proud, pretending the humans were never essential. They called it post-human diplomacy, an era of peace without violence, but peace without vigilance soon became an illusion. Far from the core worlds, in the abandoned colonies along the Perseus Arm, whispers began spreading. Rumors of systems falling, colonies enslaved, and fleets wiped out by forces unseen. The Council dismissed them as isolated incidents, but in truth, the galaxy had begun to rot from within. The very creatures that had once feared humanity's wrath were growing bold again. And deep in a quiet corner of space, a single man, the man who once commanded entire armadas, watched it all unfold from a lonely moon called Kale's Rest. Elias had built his exile among ruins. The small settlement beneath the cliffs was silent except for the soft hum of wind through hollow steel. The war had taken everything from him, his crew, his purpose, and his belief that the galaxy could ever learn. He spent his days repairing old machines, growing food from dust, and listening to the empty frequencies of the stars. His only companion was a small drone named Arlen, a relic from his ship. Sometimes he would talk to it as if it were alive, remembering old battles, the sound of engines roaring, the faces of those who had trusted him. But one evening, as the twin suns set, the silence broke. A transmission, old, distorted, and desperate, echoed across the void. "This is Council Vessel Tethra, under attack. Unknown enemy, coordinates attached." Elias froze. The voice on the other end wasn't military, it was frightened, pleading. And though he had sworn never to interfere again, something in his chest tightened. Humanity had left the galaxy, but the galaxy hadn't yet learned to survive without them. He listened again and again, staring at the flickering coordinates on the screen. The signal came from a system once protected by the Terran fleet, now abandoned. He remembered it, the Kavarn sector. During the war, it had been a front line, the place where humanity had stood between the Council and extinction. But now it was forgotten, left to scavengers and ghosts. Elias sat for hours, staring into the dark. Then, without a word, he rose, walked to a rusted hangar, and pulled the tarp from an old ship. The vessel's hull bore the faded insignia of the Terran command, a silver eagle across a blue field. "Just one last flight," he muttered. The engines coughed to life, shaking dust from the walls, and the stars reflected in his eyes once more. When he left Kale's Rest, no one saw him go, but the universe felt it. The quiet awakening of something that had been sleeping too long. The Tethra's distress beacon led him into a dead system. The stars there were faint, their light dimmed by drifting debris from long-forgotten wars. The ship appeared on his scanner, a Council cruiser, its hull torn open like a wound. Elias maneuvered closer, scanning for life signs. What he saw chilled him. The energy signature was not alien, it was familiar. Terran technology, twisted and weaponized, firing upon its creators. He docked silently and entered through a ruptured airlock. Inside, the corridors were filled with smoke and the scent of scorched metal. The crew lay where they'd fallen. Council officers, diplomats, and guards, all lifeless. But among them, one survivor gasped weakly, clutching a data core. You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Elias knelt beside her. "Who did this?" Her eyes widened, reflecting his face. "Humans," she said. "But not like you." Before he could ask more, she was gone. The words echoed in his mind as he examined the core. The data revealed a terrible truth. Fragments of the old Terran fleet had survived, but they no longer served humanity, they served vengeance. In their bitterness, some humans had turned their rage against the council that betrayed them, forming a hidden faction known as the Revenant Protocol. They hunted council worlds, targeting the very species that once stood against Earth. The galaxy now faced the one thing it had feared most, a human war with no restraint, no morality, no end. Elias sat in the dark, the core glowing faintly in his hands. For years he had believed walking away was the right choice, that humanity's absence would teach the galaxy humility. But now, he realized the void he left behind had become a breeding ground for monsters wearing human faces. And if he didn't stop them, the entire galaxy would burn again, this time without mercy. He reactivated his ship's AI and sent a transmission into deep space. To any Terran still listening, this is Commander Elias Ward of the Old Fleet. I am re-engaging. The Revenant Protocol ends tonight. His message rippled through old Terran channels, long thought dead. Somewhere in the void, old satellites awoke. Warships buried in forgotten shipyards came to life, and the last true remnants of humanity stirred. Within hours, Elias's old vessel, the Vigilant Dawn, stood ready once again. He flew into the Kavarn system where the Revenant fleet had gathered, their ships dark and jagged, powered by hatred. When his signal appeared on their scanners, they hesitated. The voice that followed froze every transmission line across the battlefield. "You've forgotten what it means to be human," he said, calm but unyielding. "Let me remind you, the battle that followed would be remembered for centuries. It wasn't a war of fleets or numbers. It was a reckoning." Elias fought with precision and restraint, disabling ships rather than destroying them, breaking the code of vengeance without spilling unnecessary blood. One by one, the Revenant ships fell silent. And when their leader finally spoke, his voice trembled. "You abandoned us. You left us to die." Elias's answer was quiet but powerful. "I left because we'd forgotten why we fought. I came back because I remembered." He transmitted the data core's contents to every channel in the galaxy. The evidence of the Council's betrayal, their lies, their manipulations that had turned friend against friend. The truth spread faster than light, and for the first time since the Great War, the galaxy saw humanity not as conquerors or saviors, but as the mirror of its own sins. When the battle ended, Elias didn't claim victory. He turned his ship away from the stars once more. The Council called for him, begged him to return, to lead, to rebuild, but he refused. Humanity's strength, he believed, was never meant to rule. It was meant to remind. The galaxy finally understood what it had lost when humanity walked away. Courage without cruelty, strength without domination, compassion born from scars. On a quiet, nameless moon, Elias landed for the last time. He stepped out beneath a sky filled with unfamiliar constellations, the sound of wind whispering over dust, and smiled faintly. "We've done enough," he murmured, as the Vigilant Dawn powered down behind him. Years later, alien historians would write of a lone human who ended the war between stars not with conquest, but with conscience. The galaxy called him the last commander, the man who fought without hate and walked away from glory. And though humanity remained silent, its influence lingered like starlight, soft, enduring, eternal. For even in absence, humanity's spirit lived on in every civilization that rose, in every act of mercy, in every decision to choose peace over pride. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what humanity truly means, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Join me again for more HFY Sci-Fi stories, where the stars remember, and humanity's legend never fades. The silence after the Great War was the kind that didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow, like the echo of something immense that had died. The Galactic Council sat in its grand halls, shining with polished marble and gold light, pretending that victory had come through unity, when in truth it had come through exhaustion. The humans were gone, their fleets withdrawn, their colonies dark. No Terran voice spoke in the council anymore. No human ambassadors stood in the chambers where decisions shaped the future of the stars. Entire sectors once guarded by the Terran defense fleet were left unpatrolled, their defense satellites cold and silent. At first, the galaxy celebrated. Planets that had long resented humanity's strength called it liberation. Council representatives toasted to a new dawn without Terran influence. But beneath the cheering, an uneasy truth crept through. Trade slowed, pirate activity rose, and border worlds began to vanish from communication networks. The galaxy had not realized that humanity, for all its flaws, had been the weight that held the balance still. On a remote moon called Kale's Rest, Elias Ward lived in silence. He had walked away from everything. His medals, his command, even the fleet that had once looked to him as its heart. The moon was barren, its sky a burnt orange by day and a deep, haunting violet by night. He built his home from the wreckage of old dropships, powered by solar panels scavenged from a forgotten station. The days passed slowly. He would wake before dawn, drink from a metal flask, and watch the horizon as the twin suns rose. Sometimes he spoke to no one for weeks, save for the low hum of his maintenance drone, Arlen. In its simple, obedient beeps, he found a strange comfort, proof that something still listened. His hands, once calloused from gripping weapon controls, now worked soil and steel, repairing old circuits, tending to crops. But the silence carried weight. In the stillness, memories of war played like distant echoes. The shouts of dying crew, the rumble of weapons fire, the static of final transmissions. He told himself he left because he was tired, but deep down, he knew it was because he no longer trusted what humanity had become. Sometimes Elias would climb to the ridge above his outpost, sit among the rocks, and look toward the distant stars. The galaxy he once defended seemed so small from here, each point of light a lie. He remembered the day he resigned, the council chamber filled with alien delegates cloaked in silk and arrogance. They had called the war a necessary lesson, dismissing the millions of human soldiers who had perished as collateral for galactic stability. Elias had stood silently as they signed their treaty, his fists trembling. When one counselor, a Serati noble with pale, glassy eyes, called humanity a weapon finally sheathed, Elias had simply turned and walked away. He never saluted again. To him, humanity's greatest strength had never been its weapons. It was the will to stand against injustice, even when standing alone. But when that will was used and discarded, when their sacrifices were forgotten, he saw no purpose in staying. So he left the stars behind, believing the galaxy deserved the peace it had begged for. But peace never came. Far beyond the Council's reach, in the unclaimed sectors where Terran patrols had once flown, new powers began to rise. The Torkai syndicates, old enemies once crushed under human fleets, returned from exile. They began enslaving border colonies, mining their worlds for resources, knowing no one would come to stop them. The Council sent small patrols, half-hearted and ill-prepared, which vanished one by one. And yet, in their arrogance, the Council refused to admit weakness. They issued statements of containment and diplomatic progress, while entire systems burned. In the taverns of trade worlds, smugglers and mercenaries whispered of ghost ships, pirates using Terran weaponry, ambushing convoys in the dark. Rumors claimed they were remnants of the human fleet gone rogue. Some said they were deserters seeking revenge. Others claimed they were machines following forgotten commands. Whatever the truth, fear began to spread again. The galaxy, once proud of its independence, was realizing how much it had relied on the very species it drove away. Back on Kale's Rest, Elias knew nothing of it until the day the signal came. It was evening. The sky was a red haze as the sun sank below the horizon, the wind carrying the dry scent of metal and dust. Arlen hovered quietly near him as he calibrated an old antenna. Something he did out of habit, not hope. Then, a sharp burst of static broke the air, followed by a faint voice. Elias froze. He turned a dial, filtering through the noise until the words became clear. "This is Council Vessel Tethra under attack. We are unarmed. Requesting any allied response." The voice trembled, filled with panic, fading in and out with the crackle of interference. The coordinates blinked onto his screen. Deep in the Kavarn sector, a place he hadn't heard mentioned since the war. He leaned back, his breath steady but cold. The Tethra's name stirred something buried. It had once been an escort ship that carried diplomats through Terran-protected space. The irony was cruel. Without humanity, it now begged for help in the void they had left. Elias sat there for a long time, staring at the signal pulsing in red light. He told himself it wasn't his concern. The Council had made its choice. They had mocked humanity, stripped it of its honor, and sent it into silence. He owed them nothing. But the voice, young, desperate, played again, softer this time, like a ghost. "Please, anyone." That one word tore through the walls he had built around himself. He closed his eyes and saw faces, the officers he had led, the soldiers who had trusted him, the promise he had made to protect not just humanity, but anyone who couldn't protect themselves. "Damn it," he muttered. He rose from his chair and walked to the hangar. The door creaked open, revealing the old ship hidden beneath tarps and dust. The Vigilant Dawn. He ran his hand along its hull, tracing the faint outline of the Terran Eagle. The ship's metal was cold, but in that touch, he felt something awaken. Not rage, but purpose. Hours later, as the engines roared to life for the first time in years, the dust around Kale's rest lifted like a storm. The ground trembled as the Vigilant Dawn rose slowly, the moon shrinking beneath its thrusters. Elias didn't look back. He set the coordinates and stared into the infinite dark. "One more mission," he whispered. The stars ahead shimmered, cold and distant, as if holding their breath. Somewhere out there, a ship was dying, and the galaxy was learning too late that when humanity left, it had taken something with it, the courage to face the impossible. And as Elias Ward's ship vanished into the void, the silence of the past began to stir again, carrying with it the echo of humanity's return. Elias Ward's ship cut through the darkness like a forgotten memory coming back to life, its engines burning blue across a sea of silent stars. The Vigilant Dawn hadn't flown in years, but every console, every control, still responded as if it had been waiting for this moment. The hull creaked with age, and the artificial gravity pulsed unevenly, but Elias didn't care. He stared out through the canopy, eyes locked on the distant system where the distress call had originated. The coordinates replayed in his mind again and again. Kavarn sector, once a Terran stronghold, once his command, now nothing but dust and broken satellites. The old instincts began to rise within him, the quiet focus, the calm before conflict. He told himself it was just one rescue, one last act before he disappeared again. But deep down, he knew that nothing about this flight would end quietly. Hours passed in silence except for the hum of the engines and the faint buzz of static from the radio. Then, as he neared the edge of Kavarn's orbit, the wreck came into view. The Tethra, once a proud Council cruiser, now drifted through space like a corpse. Its hull was torn open, engines dead, and the beacon light flickered weakly against the void. Elias throttled down and engaged the docking clamps. The moment the magnetic locks latched onto the cruiser's hull, he felt an unease he hadn't known since the war. The atmosphere inside was cold and thin, lights flickering weakly through the haze of smoke. He stepped through the airlock, his boots clanging softly on the deck plates. The smell of scorched metal and burned circuitry filled his lungs. The corridor ahead was littered with debris, helmets, tools, and the silent remains of those who hadn't made it to the escape pods. He moved quietly, weapon drawn, scanning for movement. Then came a sound, a faint gasp from deeper within the ship. Elias followed it, stepping over shattered panels and broken conduits until he reached the bridge. There, beneath a collapsed support beam, lay a woman in a tattered council uniform. She was young, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. When she saw him, she tried to reach for her sidearm but stopped when she recognized the insignia on his chest. The faded Terran eagle. You're human," she whispered, her voice shaking. Elias knelt beside her and gently removed the beam, checking her pulse. "Who did this?" he asked. Her eyes flicked toward the main viewport where distant shadows moved beyond the glass. "Humans," she said weakly. "But not like you." He frowned, confused, but before he could press further, she coughed violently. "They called themselves the Revenants. Said the council deserved judgment." Her hand tightened on a small data core clutched to her chest. "They wanted this. They killed everyone." She tried to say more, but her breathing slowed, then stopped. Elias took the core and stood, staring through the shattered viewport. Outside, fragments of ships drifted silently. Council vessels torn apart by weapons fire he recognized all too well. Terran rail signatures, precision strikes. He inserted the core into his wrist console, and a series of encrypted files opened, revealing a horror he had hoped never to see. A fleet of Terran warships, ships that had vanished years ago, had reappeared under a new banner. The Revenant Protocol. Veterans of the old wars, disillusioned and broken, had refused to stand down when humanity withdrew. They had kept fighting not for survival but for revenge. The data logs showed raids on council planets, entire colonies wiped out, alien convoys ambushed and annihilated. They called it retribution. They called it justice. But to Elias it was madness. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were ghosts wielding humanity's legacy as a weapon. He stood there in silence, the flickering lights casting long shadows across the bridge. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to walk away like he had years ago. But he couldn't. If humanity had become a ghost story, then he was the last one who could stop it from turning into a nightmare. He turned toward the main console, activated the communication array, and sent a pulse through the deep space channels. The encryption key he used was ancient, Terran Command Priority 1. "To any Terran unit still active," his voice echoed through the empty ship. "This is Commander Elias Ward. I'm initiating contact under emergency code Sigma 7. The Revenant Protocol is active. If you can hear this, stand down. Humanity's war is over." The message repeated across dozens of frequencies. Then he waited. Minutes turned to hours, and just as he began to power down the console, a voice came through. A distorted, mechanical whisper. "Commander Ward, we remember." Elias froze. The signal was faint but unmistakably human, buried under layers of static. "You left us," the voice said. "You walked away while the council erased our names, while our brothers rotted on unmarked worlds. We carried the fire when you dropped it." The transmission crackled again, louder this time. "You can't stop us. The galaxy made us monsters. Now they'll see what monsters do." And then the line went dead. Elias leaned back against the console, his pulse steady but his thoughts racing. He knew that voice. It belonged to Admiral Rennick Hale, once his second in command, now a ghost leading an army of the damned. Hale had been brilliant, fearless, and ruthless when needed, but he had always carried a hatred for the council's hypocrisy. Elias had hoped he died in the war. Now it seemed he had lived, and turned that hatred into something far worse. "You fool," Elias muttered to himself. "You're going to burn the stars." He loaded the data core into his ship's mainframe, charting the last known location of the Revenant fleet. It was farther than he expected, beyond the council's reach, in a cluster of dead systems known as the Gray Expanse. That was where he would go. Not as a soldier, not as a hero, but as the last human who still believed humanity was more than vengeance. When the vigilant dawn broke free of the Tethra's wreckage, the engines glowed brighter than they had in years. Elias sat in silence as the navigation system plotted the jump route. He thought of the young officer on the bridge, her voice trembling as she said the word humans. He thought of Hale and the men and women who followed him, twisted now by anger and time. And he thought of the galaxy, the same one that had begged for humanity's help and then celebrated their exile. He almost pitied them. Almost. The stars stretched before him, endless and cold, as he whispered a single promise to the empty air. If they've forgotten what it means to be human, I'll remind them. Then he engaged the jump drive, and the vigilant dawn vanished into hyperspace, leaving behind only silence and the faint glow of burning wreckage. A warning to the galaxy that humanity's return would not be gentle. When the vigilant dawn emerged from hyperspace, the void was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. The gray expanse lived up to its name, a dead region of space where light itself seemed to fade. Stars flickered faintly behind veils of dust, and hulks of derelict ships drifted in eerie silence. Once, this had been a thriving corridor of Terran trade and defense, a lifeline between colonies. Now it was a graveyard. Elias watched as his scanners flickered uncertainly, struggling to process the readings ahead. There were ships out there, thousands of them, but they weren't moving in formation. They hung in strange, deliberate stillness, like a fleet waiting for something. The Revenant Fleet. Vessels that once bore the proud markings of the Terran Navy now carried no emblems at all. Their hulls were painted black, stripped of names, lit only by the red glow of their engines. The sight sent a chill through Elias's spine. These were not ships of defense or duty anymore, they were ships of revenge. He powered down his external lights and approached slowly, using only passive sensors. The comm channels were alive with encrypted signals, human frequencies twisted into something harsh and unrecognizable. Fragments of voices echoed through his systems. Battle cries, oaths, fragments of an anthem that had been warped beyond recognition. It wasn't the Terran anthem of hope and unity. It was darker, filled with fury and pain. The humans here had not moved on. They had built their own order from the ashes. The Revenant Protocol was more than an army. It was a nation of ghosts. As Elias studied their formation, his heart grew heavy. He saw old ship designs, frigates from the Second Expansion era, cruisers once stationed on Mars, and dreadnoughts that had vanished during the last Terran evacuation. Somehow, these remnants had gathered here, forgotten by time, kept alive by those who refused to surrender. A signal flashed on his display. Incoming transmission. Elias hesitated for only a moment before accepting it. The screen filled with static. Then the shadowed face of a man appeared, older, scarred, with eyes that burned like embers. "Elias Ward," the voice said, calm but venomous. "I wondered when you'd crawl back from whatever hole you buried yourself in." It was Admiral Renick Hale. Once his friend, once the man who had sworn to follow him anywhere. "You shouldn't have come here," Hale continued. "You left us when the Council betrayed us. You let them write our history, erase our dead, and call it peace." Elias's jaw tightened. "You think I don't remember?" he said quietly. "I was there when we buried those men, Hale. I was there when the Council spat on our graves. But this isn't justice. It's slaughter." Hale laughed, low and bitter. "Justice died when humanity walked away. We're all that's left. The galaxy only respects fear, Elias. You taught us that." Elias leaned forward. "No, I taught you restraint. I taught you that power means nothing without control." The Admiral's image flickered. Behind him, the outline of his flagship, the Revenant's hand, loomed like a shadow. "You don't understand," Hale said. "The Council has forgotten what we did for them. They've enslaved worlds again, raised their fleets, spread lies that humanity was the enemy. So we'll remind them. Every colony they built on the bones of our soldiers will burn until they speak our names again." Elias could see it in his eyes. The same fire that had once inspired loyalty now consumed him completely. He shook his head. "You're not fighting for humanity anymore. You're fighting for your hatred." Hale leaned closer to the screen. "And you? What are you fighting for? Redemption? Peace? You don't get to claim either. You left." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving only the hum of the Vigilant Dawn's engines. Elias sat in the darkness for a long time, staring at the empty screen. The air in the cockpit felt heavier, colder. He thought about Hale's words, about the lives lost and the ideals twisted by grief. Hale wasn't wrong. The Council had betrayed humanity, used them, and then discarded them. But revenge had never been the answer. The moment humans became the monsters others feared, they lost the very thing that made them different. He couldn't let that happen again. Not to them. Not to the memory of those who died believing in something better. He opened a new frequency, broadcasting on all Terran channels, his voice steady and deliberate. This is Commander Elias Ward of the Terran Defense Fleet. To all units operating under the Revenant Protocol. Stand down. You claim to fight for our dead, but you dishonor them with every life you take. Humanity didn't survive the stars to become what it once swore to destroy. For a moment, only static answered. Then 100 voices cut in, layered over one another, filled with rage and disbelief. Traitor, coward, council dog. The words tore through the comms like blades. But beneath them, a few quieter voices lingered, hesitant, uncertain. Some of them still remembered him, still respected him. He could feel it. Not all of them had fallen completely into Hale's madness. There was still hope. He powered up the ship's external projectors and transmitted an image to the entire fleet, a recording from the old war. It showed the human fleet shielding alien refugees, the battles where Terrans had fought not for dominance, but for protection. "This is who we were," he said softly. "This is who we are supposed to be." The response came with thunder. The Revenant fleet began to move, their engines igniting in unison. Hale's voice cut through the noise. "You've had your chance, old man. You've made your choice." And then the first missile streaked across the void. Elias gripped the controls, his ship rolling hard as explosions erupted around him. The Vigilant Dawn had once been a warship of legends, and though time had weathered its frame, its spirit was still fierce. He weaved through the chaos, firing flares and countermeasures, outmaneuvering ships twice his size. But he wasn't here to destroy them, he was here to remind them. Every shot he fired was calculated to disable, not kill. Every maneuver was aimed at evasion, not vengeance. The Revenants attacked with fury, yet he fought with purpose, and in that contrast lay the heart of humanity itself. As the battle raged, fragments of comms filled the air, some shouting Hale's name, others whispering Elias's. A splinter had formed. The Revenants were no longer united. Elias's strategy was working not through power, but through conscience. He was forcing them to remember what they had been. Still, the odds were overwhelming. His ship took hits, alarms screamed, and fires erupted in the corridors. The Vigilant Dawn trembled as systems began to fail. He rerouted power manually, the controls burning hot under his hands. "Come on, old girl," he muttered. "Just a little longer." He turned his ship toward Hale's flagship and locked in a direct trajectory. Through the smoke and fire, the two ships faced each other. The man who believed humanity had to remind the galaxy of its mercy, and the man who believed it must remind them of its wrath. When their communications linked again, Hale's voice was low, almost calm. "If you destroy me, Ward, they'll still follow my memory." Elias replied, his voice steady. "Then I'll make sure that memory remembers who we were." He transmitted one final message, one that would reach every ship, every receiver across the stars. A message that reminded them of the oath they had sworn. Humanity fights not to conquer, but to protect. Not to destroy, but to endure. And then he charged. The impact lit up the gray expanse like dawn breaking through endless night. Ships scattered, alarms wailed, and silence fell. When the light faded, the Vigilant Dawn was gone, its wreckage drifting in the debris field beside the shattered remains of the Revenant's hand. For a long time, nothing moved. Then, one by one, the Revenant ships powered down their weapons. Across the galaxy, the transmission Elias had sent replayed in every language, on every channel, over and over again. And as it echoed through the void, the galaxy finally remembered. Not the war, not the violence, but the humanity behind it. For a while, the galaxy thought Elias Ward was dead. His ship had vanished in the explosion, his signal lost amid the static of destroyed frequencies, and the gray expanse, once alive with conflict, fell eerily still. News of the battle spread like wildfire through the systems, carried by traders, mercenaries, and broken transmission logs. The Revenant fleet had been shattered. Their flagship, the Revenant's Hand, destroyed. Their leader, Admiral Hale, gone. And yet, what lingered most wasn't the destruction. It was the message. The final broadcast of Commander Elias Ward, repeated by the wreckage of his ship, bounced endlessly between satellites and black box recorders. Humanity fights not to conquer, but to protect. Not to destroy, but to endure. The words traveled farther than any weapon ever could, reaching colonies, outposts, and worlds that had long forgotten the voice of a human. At first, the Council dismissed it as propaganda, an emotional remnant from an old war hero. They called it a romantic myth, unwilling to acknowledge that one man had done what entire fleets could not: stop a war without annihilation. But among the frontier worlds, where people lived by the grace of old Terran trade routes and the fear of pirate kings, the story became something more. They said a lone Terran ship had flown into the jaws of vengeance and made even the stars bow in silence. They said the man aboard had reminded the galaxy that mercy was not weakness and that true strength didn't need witnesses. The tale spread until it became legend. And though Elias Ward's name was spoken with awe, it was always followed by the same quiet question whispered in cantinas and docking bays alike. Was he really gone? Weeks later, scavenger crews entered the gray expanse. They expected to find nothing but twisted metal and radiation, but what they found instead left them speechless. Among the debris of two great ships, a single escape pod drifted, its beacon faint but active. Inside was a man, unconscious but alive. His vitals were weak, his uniform scorched, his dog tags reading only, Ward E. When he awoke aboard their freighter, his first words were not of thanks or confusion. He simply asked, "Did they stop?" When the scavenger captain told him the revenants had scattered, Elias closed his eyes and whispered, "Then it's over." He refused their offer to return to Council space, instead asking to be left on a quiet moon nearby. He didn't want medals or recognition. He wanted silence again. And so they left him there, on an unnamed world with clear skies and tall blue grass, never realizing that the man they had saved would become the very myth that reshaped the galaxy. Back in the Council chambers, fear began to take root beneath the surface. The counselors met behind closed doors, uneasy about what had happened. The transmission had not only reached their worlds, it had reached their people. The message had awakened something dangerous: respect for humanity. Across alien species that once despised them, stories of Elias Ward spread as if carried by the wind. Workers and soldiers began asking questions. Why had the humans truly left? What had they sacrificed? The Council tried to control the narrative, but the truth was a wildfire, and every attempt to silence it only made it grow stronger. They called emergency assemblies, passing new decrees to reinforce their authority. But the old fear was returning, the fear that one day humanity might come back. In time, fragments of Terran technology began reappearing. Abandoned human colonies once stripped of value now became pilgrimage sites. Aliens came to study what humanity had left behind: ancient archives, relics of industry, and the writings of philosophers who had once tried to teach cooperation between worlds. On one such world, a young alien scholar named Vekare found a data crystal embedded within an old Terran outpost. It contained a message, a recording of Elias Ward during his years in exile before the final battle. "We fought for peace," his voice said, calm but heavy with memory. "But peace cannot survive without truth, and truth cannot survive without those willing to bear its burden. If humanity must vanish for the galaxy to learn, then let our absence be our final lesson." The words spread like scripture. Meanwhile, far beyond the Council's reach, small groups of humans who had remained in hidden colonies began to emerge. They carried no banners, no armies, only knowledge. They reached out to frontier species, teaching old Terran engineering, medicine, and governance. They rebuilt quietly, guided by the ideals Elias had embodied. These wardens, as they came to be known, carried on his legacy not as soldiers, but as guardians of stability. And though none had ever met him, they swore to live by his creed, to fight only when others could not, to protect without pride, and to endure even when unseen. Slowly, the name Ward became something more than a man. It became a symbol, a vow whispered by those who sought to bring light into dark places. But the galaxy is never free from shadows for long. Years after the Revenant War, new powers rose from the fractures of the old council. They remembered the terror of human fleets, the destruction that one man had brought with nothing but resolve, and they began to fear his legend more than his actions. Some claimed the humans would return stronger than before. Others said Elias still lived, watching from the edge of the stars. In secret, the council commissioned a series of expeditions to find him, not to thank him, but to ensure he could never rise again. Fleets searched the uncharted sectors, following the rumors, but all they found were whispers. An old ship seen gliding between nebulae, a faint Terran signal near the galactic rim, a shadow passing through the void. Some swore it was him. Others believed it was only the universe remembering what it once feared. On that quiet bluegrass moon, Elias Ward grew old. The days were long and silent, the nights filled with distant starlight that reminded him of all he had lost. He built a small shelter beside a stream, repaired an old comm unit only to turn it off again, and lived among the silence that once haunted him. Sometimes, when he looked up, he wondered if his people had found peace. He liked to believe they had, but deep down, he knew humanity would never stay silent forever. It wasn't in their nature. They were wanderers, builders, and protectors. They would return, not as conquerors, but as something wiser. And when they did, he hoped the galaxy would be ready. The universe, vast and ancient, eventually forgot the details but never the feeling. Monuments rose on worlds Elias would never see. Statues carved in his likeness, though no one truly knew his face. Pilgrims spoke his words like prayers, and in time, even species that had once hated humanity began to honor the ideals he had lived and died for. Across the stars, the name Elias Ward became a legend, a ghost, a guardian, a symbol of what it meant to be human. And though his story had ended quietly on that lonely moon, his legacy endured in every act of courage, every choice of mercy, and every whisper that reminded the galaxy of the truth he had died to teach. Humanity may walk away, but it never truly leaves as decades turned into centuries. The name Elias Ward became less of a memory and more of a myth. His words, once transmitted from the wreckage of the Vigilant Dawn, evolved into doctrine. Children across alien worlds learned of the man who walked away from war yet won peace for an entire galaxy. The Galactic Council, fractured, then reformed, had long since changed faces and names, but his legend remained embedded in its conscience like an eternal flame. Scholars debated whether Ward was real or symbolic, a human ghost created to explain the moral turning point that ended an age of blood. But every historian, no matter their origin, agreed on one thing. After the silence of humanity, the galaxy itself had become quieter, wiser, more self-aware. And though Terrans were still absent, their presence lingered like the glow of a long-extinguished star that continued to shine in memory. On the rim worlds, far from the polished halls of the council, there were whispers again. A new generation of explorers spoke of strange ships, sleek, silver crafts that didn't match any known design. They moved like shadows, appearing near dying colonies only to vanish again, leaving food, tools, and medicine behind. They never took credit, never spoke a word. Locals began to call them Wardens of the Dawn. Some believed they were human descendants. Others thought they were simply inspired by the myth of Elias Ward. But one thing was certain. Wherever these silent visitors passed, violence subsided. Pirates fled, corrupt governors resigned, and famine disappeared. Their influence spread quietly, like the first light before morning. The galaxy, once so loud with arrogance and conflict, began to live in uneasy harmony again. Not by fear, but by the memory of what fear had once cost. Meanwhile, on an unnamed planet at the edge of a forgotten system, beneath skies painted in deep violet hues, an old man watched the stars. His beard had turned white as frost, his hands rough from years of solitude, yet his eyes still carried that familiar clarity, the look of someone who had seen both the worst and the best of existence. Elias Ward had lived far longer than he expected. Time no longer held meaning for him. The days flowed like quiet rivers, and the stars above became his only company. His ship, or what remained of it, lay buried in the earth behind his small home, its hull now overgrown with blue grass and flowering vines. At night, when the wind brushed through the valley, the faint metallic hum of the vigilant dawn's core could still be heard, a heartbeat from the past, still pulsing softly beneath the soil. Sometimes he would light a small fire and speak aloud, though there was no one to answer. "They think we're gone," he would say quietly, eyes glimmering in the firelight. "Maybe that's for the best. Maybe they needed to learn without us watching." There were moments when he wondered if the humans who survived had done the right thing. Leaving, vanishing, letting the galaxy face its own reflection. He had once believed peace would be permanent, but peace was fragile. It needed vigilance. It needed remembrance. And if there was one thing Elias Ward had learned, it was that memory was the most powerful weapon of all. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the horizon, a faint ripple appeared in the sky, a shimmer like light bending through water. He looked up and froze. The pattern was unmistakable. A hyperspace signature, one used only by Terran ships centuries ago. He waited, heart still, as the distortion grew brighter. Then, emerging from the shimmer, came a vessel small, elegant, glowing faintly blue. It descended slowly until it hovered above the valley. The wind stirred the grass into waves as the craft landed gently. The ramp lowered, releasing a rush of air that carried with it a sound Elias hadn't heard in ages. A human voice. "Commander Ward," it said softly, unsure, reverent. "We've been looking for you." He stepped forward, his movements slow but steady. From the ship emerged a young woman in a dark gray flight suit, her features unmistakably human yet subtly different. Eyes of silver, skin faintly luminescent under the moonlight. "You're one of the wardens," Elias said, recognizing the insignia on her shoulder. She nodded, emotion flickering in her voice. "We followed your transmissions, your records, your lessons. The colonies have changed, Commander. The Council fell again, but it rebuilt stronger. Your words guided the ones who rose from the ruins. Humanity's return is no longer feared. It's hoped for." Elias smiled faintly, though his eyes grew distant. "I never wanted to be followed," he said. "I just wanted them to remember who we were." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "They remember, sir. They built a world in your name, one where the old Terran ideals are law. They call it New Soul. They sent me to bring you home." For a long moment he said nothing. The stars reflected in his eyes like tiny galaxies. "Home," he repeated softly, as if the word itself was foreign. He looked toward the buried outline of his ship and the valley he had called his sanctuary for so long. "I don't know if I have a home anymore," he whispered. The young woman smiled gently. "You do, Commander. You're the reason we have one." Behind her, the ship's lights pulsed brighter, illuminating the valley like dawn breaking across the land. Elias closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the engines, the same sound that had once filled his life with purpose. Then, with a quiet breath, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's go see what they've built." As he climbed aboard, the ramp lifted, sealing him inside. The ship rose slowly, leaving behind the lonely valley, the stream, and the resting place of the vigilant dawn. Through the viewport, he watched his small home shrink into the distance until it became just another shadow on the surface of the world. For the first time in many years, he felt something he thought he had lost: hope. The engines roared softly as the stars stretched before him, forming rivers of light. The young pilot turned toward him. "They'll want to hear your story," she said. Elias smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure it's worth telling." When the ship leapt into hyperspace, the sky behind it shimmered, and for a moment, the whole world glowed with pale blue light, the color of rebirth. Somewhere beyond the known stars, humanity stirred again, not as conquerors but as keepers, as teachers, as guardians of the peace they had once bled to create. And though Elias Ward would live to see this new dawn, the legend of the man who walked away from the war had already taken root across the galaxy. It would outlast him, carried in the hearts of every being who chose compassion over cruelty, restraint over rage, and unity over fear. The galaxy had finally realized what humanity's silence had meant. The absence of their light had shown everyone how dark the stars could truly be. And when that light returned, it wasn't blinding. It was warm, steady, and eternal. Humanity had not come back to rule the galaxy. It had come back to remind it why life among the stars was worth protecting. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, if it made you see the strength in silence and the power of redemption, please like, comment, and subscribe. More HFY Sci-Fi stories, tales where humanity rises, falls, and always returns, proving again and again that even in the coldest corners of space, our spirit never truly fades.